A single shot rings out across a moonless field, and within seconds the night explodes into chaos. British soldiers stumble out of their tents half-dressed, grabbing rifles they can barely see, as a wall of gunfire rips through the darkness from an enemy they cannot even locate. Horses scream. Officers shout orders nobody can hear over the thunder of artillery. Within minutes, one of the most powerful armies on the face of the earth is in full retreat, chased off a hill by farmers, not professional soldiers, not a trained army, farmers. This is not some minor colonial skirmish that history forgot. This is the opening shot of a war that would humiliate the British Empire 3 times in a single week, a week so catastrophic that London newspapers simply called it Black Week. This is the story of how a nation of roughly 200,000 people, with no standing army, no war college, no empire of its own, brought the greatest military power on the planet to its knees for nearly 3 years. This is the Anglo-Boer War, and if you think you know how empires win wars, what you're about to hear will change your mind completely. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you will understand why some historians call this the first war of the 20th century, fought 17 years before anyone had heard the words World War, and you will see how its horrors would echo through the trenches of Flanders barely a decade later. To understand why this war broke out, we have to go back more than 2 centuries to the moment Dutch ships first anchored at the southern tip of Africa. In the mid-17th century, Dutch settlers established a colony at the Cape, meant only as a resupply station on the route to the East Indies. But these settlers stayed and spread inland. They called themselves Afrikaners, spoke their own dialect of Dutch, and became known simply by the word for farmer, Boers. Generation after generation, they pushed deeper into the interior, seizing land from the native African population and, in many cases, enslaving them outright. In 1806, during the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain seized Cape Town and held it permanently after 1815. The British imposed their own laws, their own language, their own courts on a population that had spent nearly 2 centuries building an identity separate from London. Tensions simmered over language and culture, but the breaking point came in 1834, when Britain abolished slavery across its empire. For a society built on forced labor, this was catastrophic, and it enraged the Boer population to its core. Between 1835 and 1840, thousands of Boer families loaded their ox wagons and simply left in what became known as the Great Trek, searching for land where no British official could ever tell them what to do again. There they founded 2 new republics, the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, better known as the Transvaal independence at last from Britain. But independence is very difficult to keep when you happen to be sitting on something the rest of the world desperately wants. As the British Empire kept expanding across southern Africa, it eventually found itself sharing a direct border with the Boer states, and friction exploded into war in 1880 and 1881. Astonishingly, the Boers won, forcing Britain to formally recognize their independence, a humiliation London would never forget. Then, as if history itself were setting a trap, prospectors struck gold. Between 1884 and 1886, enormous gold deposits were discovered in the Transvaal, and fortune seekers from across the empire flooded in. This newfound wealth caught the eye of Cecil Rhodes, the Prime Minister of the neighboring Cape Colony and one of the wealthiest mining magnates alive. In 1895, he backed a covert mercenary scheme to overthrow the Boer government, known as the Jameson Raid. It collapsed into total failure, but the damage was done. The Boers now knew with absolute certainty that Britain intended to take their independence away, one way or another. For 4 more years, Britain applied relentless pressure, and by 1899, troops were massing in neighboring Natal, convinced an invasion was imminent. The Boers made a decision that shocked the world. They struck first. On October 11, 1899, the Second Boer War began, and within days the most powerful empire on earth would suffer defeats, so humiliating they would trigger a public reckoning back home in London. The Boers had no standing army, only a militia system. In wartime, every able-bodied man between 16 and 60 was called up, expected to arrive with his own rifle and horse, supplemented by thousands of modern German Mauser rifles. They had no formal military training whatsoever, and yet they were lethal because marksmanship was practically a national obsession. An American journalist named Howard Hillegas observed that target shooting had almost taken the place occupied by billiards in Europe. Every Boer fighter was a mounted rifleman, capable of seizing high ground, dismounting, unleashing devastating fire, and vanishing again. Decades later, Winston Churchill was so impressed he named Britain's special forces after the Afrikaans word for a raiding unit. Commando in total, the Boers could field around 60,000 fighters, motivated and well-armed, but with one fatal weakness: they could not sustain a long war. Their population was tiny, Their supplies depended on Europe, and they feared an uprising or an attack from the powerful Zulu kingdom. They needed a fast, decisive victory. Britain's weight, by contrast, was almost unimaginable, roughly 250,000 troops available, one of whom, strangely enough, was my own great-grandfather. This would be the 226th conflict fought during the reign of Queen Victoria out of 230 total, and Britain had won nearly all of them through discipline and firepower. But the army had almost no experience facing modern rifles, and its commanders were so confident that they seemed to have forgotten their own humiliating defeat by these very same farmers less than 2 decades earlier. One more thing worth remembering. Officially, both sides declared this a, quote, white man's war. In reality, black Africans performed critical roles for both sides from the very first day, as laborers, scouts, and in some cases armed combatants. This war was never confined to two sides, no matter what the official declarations claimed. When the guns opened fire, the Boers actually outnumbered British forces already in South Africa, 40,000 to 20,000, and their plan was built entirely around speed, sweeping in and crushing isolated garrisons before reinforcements could arrive. Their invasion moved on 4 fronts at once, besieging the railway town of Mafeking, surrounding the diamond hub of Kimberley, pushing into the Cape Midlands. But the main thrust drove into Natal, where Britain had stationed most of its available army. The British had actually planned to use Natal as a launch pad to invade Boer territory, but the Boers beat them to it. On October 20th, 1899, the first pitched battle of the war erupted as Boer artillery opened fire from Talana Hill onto the British camp below. British troops rallied and drove the Boers off the high ground. Technically a victory, but General Simons was mortally wounded and 10% of his force became casualties in a single morning. Captain Nugent of the King's Royal Rifle Corps described the ground in front of him as literally rising in dust from bullets, the incessant fire of the Mausers blending into one long, hideous roar. He looked back and saw the ground already strewn with bodies. Moments later, he was shot through the knee, the impact so violent he said it felt exactly like being struck full force with a club. Despite the win, the British were now in serious danger, mobile Boer columns threatening to encircle them, forcing a harrowing retreat toward the garrison town of Ladysmith. A follow-up British victory at Elandslaagte briefly suggested the tide might turn, but the Boer advance into Natal continued, and by the end of October, Commander George White faced an impossible choice: withdraw and wait for reinforcements, or gamble everything on a decisive attack. He gambled. On October 30th, his forces were badly coordinated at the Battle of Ladysmith, and the Boers won a stunning victory. White retreated his entire army into the town, and the Boers laid siege. The opening weeks had been a success story almost too good to believe. The Boers had defeated Britain's main field army in South Africa and trapped it. If Ladysmith fell, they might just win the entire war outright. And what happened next would push this conflict into an entirely different category of horror. In November 1899, a fresh British army of 45,000 men, under General Redvers Buller, set sail to break the siege, forced to abandon a planned invasion. Buller split his force in 3 and personally led 20,000 men into Natal. Because British forces had to move along fixed railway lines, surprise was impossible, and the Boers had all the time in the world to dig in and wait. What followed became one of the most catastrophic single weeks in the entire history of the British Empire. On December 10th, a British night march to surprise Boer positions went badly wrong, the column getting lost in the dark and waking up directly inside the enemy position rather than on its flank. A doomed frontal assault into prepared rifle fire ended in slaughter within minutes at the Battle of Stormberg. The very next day at Magersfontein, a thunderstorm slowed another British advance, and troops were caught helplessly in the open at first light, pinned down and forced to retreat in disorder. Then, on December 15th, came the worst blow of all. Buller's main army attacked entrenched Boer positions along the Tugela River. British artillery advanced too far forward and was knocked out within minutes, 2 entire batteries destroyed. The infantry assault fared no better, advancing in the same tight formation that had won Britain battle after battle for decades, only to be ambushed from 3 directions at once. An 18-year-old Boer fighter named Denys Reitz, who would later serve in the British Army during the First World War, remembered hearing a British voice cry out, "Bayonets, bayonets," as the enemy came on like an advancing wall. His side poured volley after volley into those closely packed ranks, so overwhelming that the entire attacking column swerved away. Anyone who got close was shot down or captured. By mid-morning, the Battle of Colenso was over. The British suffered over 1,000 casualties and lost 10 field guns. Only 38 Boers were killed or wounded. In a single week, The mightiest empire on the planet had been defeated 3 times by a nation of farmers, and the Times newspaper coined the phrase that would define it forever. Black Week. By Christmas 1899, many in the Boer republics genuinely believed the war was won, even as the sieges dragged on. But here is where this story turns, because the humiliation of Black Week did not break Britain. It galvanized it. London sent its most famous soldier, Lord Roberts, who arrived in January 1900, with tens of thousands of reinforcements pouring in from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and India, where a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi served with the Indian Ambulance Corps at the brutal Battle of Spion Kop. Yes, that Gandhi. Roberts completely reorganized the army and introduced new tactics to counter Boer firepower. On February 10, 1900, 50,000 British troops advanced on Kimberley, and cavalry finally caught the Boers off guard, bursting through their siege lines. A British officer who took part described the charge as feeling quite hopeless at first, expecting to be considered idiots for even attempting it. Yet when they finally galloped forward under withering fire, he looked down the line expecting to see men falling in masses, and saw almost no one go down, calling the feeling wonderfully exciting, like a thrilling day out hunting. Weighed down by wagons and artillery, the retreating Boers could not outrun the pursuit, and dug in at a place called Paardeberg, a critical mistake that let Imperial troops surround them completely. After a 10-day siege, 4,000 Boer fighters surrendered on February 27th, a crushing blow for such a small nation. That same day in Natal, a final British assault broke through at the Tugela Heights, and Ladysmith was relieved. With the Boer army now severely weakened, the British invaded the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, taking Bloemfontein in March and Pretoria itself in June. The final pitched battle of the conventional war came at Bergendal in late August 1900. By September, Lord Roberts stood in occupied Boer territory and proudly proclaimed the war won, returning home to England as a conquering hero. But he was catastrophically wrong. The Boers had absolutely no intention of surrendering, and what they were about to unleash would turn this war into something far darker and far more relevant to the century about to begin. As early as 1900, brilliant Boer commander Christiaan de Wet had already begun arguing his people should abandon set-piece battles entirely and wage guerrilla war against Britain's overwhelming numbers. Early signs of this new warfare appeared in an attack on an armored train carrying a young war correspondent named Winston Churchill, who observed that nothing looks more formidable than an armored train, and nothing is in fact more helpless, since it only took one blown bridge to leave the whole monster stranded, at the mercy of the enemy. De Wet turned that lesson into an art form. On March 31, 1900, he launched a spectacular ambush at Santa's Post, inflicting over 500 casualties and capturing 7 artillery pieces for the loss of just 8 men. He spent the rest of the year ambushing isolated columns and systematically destroying the railways Britain depended on, striking from the empty countryside and vanishing just as fast. After the collapse at Bergendal, the remaining Boer commanders reached the same conclusion under the leadership of Louis Botha, and the guerrilla campaign began in earnest that October, raiding supply depots and relentlessly targeting the railway lines. Unguarded trains were hijacked constantly. During one such hijacking, a stunned American businessman was robbed at gunpoint by a Boer fighter named Johannes Steyn and said, bewildered, "But sir, I thought this war was over." Steyn's reply has echoed through history ever since. "You were misinformed. This war is just beginning." And he was right. At first, the British had no answer to Boer guerrilla tactics. Too fast and too familiar with the terrain to be caught by heavier columns, British sweeps relied on so-called prisoner counts, though most captives turned out to be ordinary farmers, not actual fighters. Frustrated by an enemy they could not pin down, the British response turned brutal. In mid-1900, Lord Roberts ordered farms suspected of supplying guerrillas to be destroyed. His successor, Lord Kitchener, pushed this to a horrifying new extreme, ordering every Boer-owned farm burned regardless of guilt. This scorched earth campaign destroyed thousands of farms and left roughly 150,000 civilians homeless. Kitchener also built a network of 8,000 small fortified blockhouses along railways and river crossings, linked by wire, severely restricting Boer mobility. As with every guerrilla war, the fighting grew increasingly personal and brutal on both sides, Boer commandos plundering African villages and pro-British farms for supplies, the British continuing to burn Boer farms. Boers looted dead or captured soldiers for equipment, and the British responded by summarily executing any Boer fighter caught wearing British gear. This was no longer a war fought with any real restraint, and Kitchener's scorched earth policy was about to create a humanitarian catastrophe so severe it would permanently stain the empire's reputation, and give the world a term we still use today with a shudder: concentration camps. The British had first considered refugee camps for displaced Boer civilians back in May 1900, but when Kitchener made the system official that December, as his scorched earth campaign generated a flood of newly homeless refugees, the concentration camp system, as history remembers, it was truly born. On paper, the intention was almost humane: accommodation, food, medical care. In reality, the camps were chronically understaffed, since the army called it a purely civilian matter and refused to provide officers, while civilian authorities treated it as low priority. Many camps had inadequate sanitation. But the single worst problem was relentless overcrowding. Roughly 44,000 Boer civilians were held by March 1901. By December that same year, the number had exploded to 110,000. These conditions led to devastating outbreaks of measles and diphtheria, killing enormous numbers, including a heartbreaking share of children. A woman who was only 7 years old at the time later recalled that the camp was so lice-infested her own aunt had to cut off all her hair. She remembered thousands of newcomers arriving constantly, hundreds becoming sick almost immediately, hospital tents permanently overflowing, doctors working around the clock, and people, in her own words, dying like rats. Carts came down the rows of tents every single day just to collect the dead. There were funerals, she said, every single day. The true scale of what was happening was finally exposed by British aid worker Emily Hobhouse, whose damning report in May 1901 triggered outrage across the entire globe, aimed at her own government. She wrote that suffering pressed hardest on the children, who drooped in the terrible heat with insufficient food, and that whatever the authorities were doing, however hard they tried with limited means, it amounted to nothing more than a miserable patch on a great ill. Facing mounting fury back home, the British government appointed suffragette Millicent Fawcett to lead an official investigation, and her report confirmed every one of Hobhouse's findings, recommending sweeping reforms. From November 1901, civilian administrators took control, and conditions slowly improved. By the war's end in May 1902, the monthly death rate inside the camps had actually dropped below the pre-war baseline. But for tens of thousands of Boer civilians, these reforms came far too late. And here is a detail almost every retelling of this story leaves out. The British also built an entirely separate camp system for Black African civilians, expected to be self-sufficient and given even fewer resources than the already catastrophically underfunded Boer camps. Hobhouse never even had the chance to visit them, and the official investigation ignored them almost entirely, as though the people inside simply did not exist. Roughly 27,000 Boer civilians died in these camps, 22,000 of them children under 16. At least 25,000 additional Black African civilians also died, bringing the minimum combined death toll to at least 52,000 human beings, the overwhelming majority civilians who never fired a single shot. By early 1902, the brutal guerrilla war was finally grinding toward exhaustion. Scorched earth tactics had stripped the commandos of supplies, and the blockhouse network had crushed their once formidable mobility. The commandos were also struggling to shelter roughly 10,000 displaced Boer civilians hiding in the wilderness to avoid capture, so desperate for food and medicine that in some documented cases, fighters led their own women and children to the gates of British concentration camps and simply left them, because inside those horrific camps, there was at least a chance of survival. Boer commanders finally accepted there was no longer any realistic prospect of victory, and that fighting on would only prolong the suffering of their own people. It had been a devastatingly bloody struggle for everyone involved. The British Army suffered over 100,000 casualties, including 22,000 dead, a staggering toll for what many in London had once dismissed as a minor colonial policing action. Boer losses are estimated at roughly 30,000, including 9,000 killed. Facing this grim reality, Boer leaders opened formal negotiations, leading to a peace agreement signed in May 1902. The Boers surrendered but were granted amnesty. The British promised to protect the Dutch language. The republics were absorbed into the empire with the promise of eventual self-government, and in a decision with devastating long-term consequences. Any discussion of voting rights for Black Africans was deliberately postponed until that self-government was actually granted. So what did this brutal 3-year war actually leave behind? It shocked the British Empire to its core. forcing sweeping military reforms and pushing London to seek new alliances with Japan, France, and Russia. It became a brutal baptism of fire for an entire generation of young British officers who would go on to hold critical commands during the First World War, carrying its hard lessons with them into the trenches. And if you have been paying attention, you will have noticed just how eerily familiar so much of this already feels. Entrenched positions that could not be broken by frontal assault, barbed wire connecting fortified strongpoints, devastating rifle and artillery fire that made close formation tactics essentially suicidal, civilian populations deliberately targeted as an instrument of strategy. This war, fought on the dusty plains of South Africa at the very close of the 19th century, was in many uncomfortable ways a dark, unmistakable premonition of the horrors waiting for an entire generation of Europeans barely more than a decade later. The Anglo-Boer War rarely makes it into most people's mental picture of major world history, overshadowed by the 20th century's far larger catastrophes. But make no mistake, this was not some forgettable colonial footnote. It was a transformative conflict that foreshadowed modern industrial warfare, redefined the horrors of total war against civilians, and left permanent generational scars across an entire nation. Scars South Africa is still grappling with today. A war that began with roughly 200,000 farmers daring to defy the largest empire the modern world had ever seen, and one that ended with a death toll that shocked the entire globe. If this story of resistance, empire, and the terrible cost of total war moved you even half as much as it moved me while researching it, make sure you are subscribed, because there are far more stories like this one still waiting to be told, and I promise you, you do not want to miss what comes next.